So, taking a step forward in terms of the process itself, at organization level, in the journey of decarbonization, first of all, preparing the GAG inventory, one needs to define the scope, what all data needs to be collected, how that is to be accounted, and what reporting is to be carried out. And in this, the boundary setting is important, which is coming from the scope itself. What is the organization and operational boundaries that will be set in doing this emissions accounting. So, in terms of the organizational boundaries, basically it determines which companies are included, which operations are included. And in terms of the operational boundaries, basically it talks about all the emission sources which are included and how to categorize these emissions. So, in terms of organizational boundaries, why do we need it? Is because they're a complex business structure. There could be big organizations with a lot of subsidiaries, joint ventures, and franchisees, and all. And at the same time, we need consistency across the approach because, as said, the decarbonization is a journey. So it's not that a company starts to do the GHG accounting and hives off the high emittive industries in their boundary setting, which would give a false impression that the organization is decarbonizing, but in effect, these emissions are still happening, but somewhere else in somebody else's name. So, setting up of organizational boundaries are important for that perspective too. And there are two approaches when selecting the organizational boundaries. There could be an equity share approach, or it could be a control approach with the financial or operational control. So that is more of different ways of allocating the emissions. If there's equity share, then it's clear that it is based on the sharing results of the emissions depending upon what's the shareholding. Whereas in control approach, whether you have the control or not is what determines whether the emissions are to be accounted or not. So, to differentiate the organizational and operational boundaries, I think this can be presented graphically in here. So, organizational boundaries would account for all the entities that you would be considering, and operational boundaries would be considering all the sources of emissions which you would be accounting in the GHG inventory preparation of the company. So once this boundary setting is done, then it goes about looking into the raw data, and for getting this data, which would be emanating from different departments, different regions, different places. So there has to be a responsible person who would be able to provide this data. And once this data is provided, the aggregation and preservation of that data would be needed along with the proper evidence to ensure that this data can be cross-checked as well, followed by the assessment of this data in terms of application of emission factors, warming potentials, the calculations, and preparation of the GHG inventory itself towards resulting in the GHG report. And this GHG report essentially would contain these broader heads in terms of what the organization is, who is the person responsible for preparing this report, what is the reporting period. So generally it's an annual report, what organizational boundaries have been set in, which emissions, direct, indirect, have been considered, what are the exclusions if there are any, and comparison with the historical year. So if it is the first year, then obviously there is no historical data, but for the subsequent years, that presentation is also helpful to analyze where the industry is going, along with reference to what quantification methodologies have been used, which factors have been considered, what are the uncertainties, and a GT statement with reference to ISO 14064 could also be incorporated. So that's basically what in summary of setting the emissions. That's stage one. Now, when we are starting on the decarbonization journey, then either prior to this stage setting or subsequent to it, the acknowledging what the emissions are, the roadmap or the target setting could also happen. And this target setting basically is very important to ensure that we have a clear pathway of what we have to traverse and what should be our momentum towards reducing these emissions and how we would be able to do that. And these this target setting basically would determine what should be the base of decarbonization, and generally if the entity is a progressive one, then obviously they would be ahead of their peers. But if not, then at least these target settings should be aligned or uh, more ambitious to the peers as well to be ahead of the curve. So, what would, would be the dimensions in which the target setting can take place? So basically, there needs to be a base here to understand that okay, we are in this very year, if our emissions were 100, then in the next 5 or 10 years, we would want to reduce it by 50% or so. So that's where the time bound part comes in, and the quantification also gets incorporated, and it needs to also follow certain approved methodology. So for that, in the corporate context, there is a science-based target initiative which helps in determining what the targets should look like. And the science-based target initiative is ensures alignment with the Paris Agreement to reduce emissions below 2 degrees and essentially targeting 25 degrees of temperature, right? So, what a base year could look like, say, it could be a fixed year like year 2005, or it could be a multi-year as an average, or it could be rolling year in certain instance. So there could be different variations towards setting the base here, and most of the emission trading and registry programs they require a fixed year policy for simplicity and other reasons as well. So graphically, if you were to see a base year helps in kind of performance tracking. In certain years you could be above, certain years you could be below, and so that clearly helps in tracking the performance, whether it is whether we are decarbonizing or we are above the emissions. So different ways of target setting which can be seen from some of the example is, on one hand we have the science-based target to be more of Paris aligned. Then there are certain other targets wherein a company commits towards using 100% renewable sources. That is the RE100. Then there is carbon neutrality also as a target, wherein industries are wanting to become carbon neutral by achieving net zero emissions. And there is also the net neutrality targets taken by some IT companies, wherein not just the ongoing emissions, they look towards reducing their historic emissions also. So, so different ways in which target setting can be done. One of the ways being science-based target, as I said, which is to seek alignment with the Paris Agreement, and more and more companies are joining the Science-Based Target Initiative. There are different ways in which, under the SBTI, wherein there could be a sector-based decarbonization approach, or it could be an absolute based with absolute contraction in emissions, or it could be economic based on the emissions per value added. And these different means of target setting, and in doing so, they have set up certain criteria that essentially the company should consider the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and the exclusion in this has also been set up, like because in certain instances the accounting of emissions for certain types might be prohibitive or economically not possible. So that 5% exclusion is provided, and slowly, steadily, the company should progress toward moving and incorporating scope 3 emissions also, and more so if the scope 3 emissions are more than 40% of the people for that particular category. So those category of emissions should be accounted. So these are like different criteria which have been set up by science-based target to ensure that at least 95% of scope 1 and 2 emissions are covered, and scope 3 category, which are more than 40% of the total change emissions, should also be accounted. So once the target setting is done, then obviously the need for taking action also comes into place. And in doing so, some of the simple ways in which the emission reduction could happen is once the industry could do things like energy efficiency within their facilities by having these emission reduction plans, or moving towards more renewable energy through use of either captive generation, say in the form of solar PV, rooftops and all. Or it could be, if there are limitations to that, then certain industries could as well purchase renewable energy certificates or enter into power purchase agreements with either on-site or off-site solar or renewable energy projects. And last but not the least is look also in terms of decarbonizing the supply chain. So understanding in the supply chain where all emissions are happening and how best activities could be taken towards reducing the supply chain emissions. So if we look back on the supply chain emissions itself, so the indirect emission of one industry would be the direct emission of the other industry also. So that's where it's a chain reaction kind of thing. Like once a bigger corporate starts to do it, then it trickles down to the lower corporates who are either the suppliers or the consumer of that industry. So we talked about different means of reducing the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions in the form of renewable energy use for captive as direct sources, use of RECs for the scope 2 emissions, and incentivizing activities in the supply chain to reduce the scope 3 emissions. So in doing so, the finance is also important. So where would that money come from to take up these actions, right? So there could be different, like either this is generated internally, and one of the means for doing that is if an organization has an internal carbon pricing, to create a fund to take up climate friendly activities and to reduce emissions. Or it could be through use of external public or private funds, and there are a couple of them which can be used towards taking up climate action. Some of them are listed here. So, in terms of climate finance, basically, it's more of the definition part coming from UNFCCC. Basically, it is towards essentially either climate mitigation, which is the context of decarbonization, or it could also be climate adaptation for building resilience. It could be at a different level of application with different sources. So that's just a brief on the climate finance. Then eventually, whatsoever that is being done gets communicated to the external world also, and to the organization and its shareholder too. So in here there are a couple of things which help in communicating this to the outer world. In the form of CDP reporting or GRI or TCFD. So, or sustainability reports generally contain a reference to this. In the Indian context, we have the BRSR as well. So, this helps to improve the company's reputation, and it can also help in tracking and benchmarking its progress, to gain internal buy-in and obviously get ahead of the regulation as well. So that's in brief about the decarbonization journey. It's not a linear thing as it would appear, but continuous improvement is also a part of this overall journey. So that I'll just stop for this presentation, and we'll look forward to any questions that you may have, which you can post later. Thank you.